You think that BMW engineers would have accounted for heavy rain?
Now, there are a few different engines in this range, and some of them are uncharacteristically good. You might be surprised to find out which ones though.
No matter which model, these things are as sharp and as performance orientated as any driver's ever going to need. Okay, look, we need to start this video off with a bit of a disclaimer, because when we went researching through all the different owners groups and forums, the overwhelming response that we received was that owners absolutely adore this generation of X3 and X4. Many even claim that the build quality and reliability is the best they've experienced from a BMW in a very, very long time. And as a complete package, very few other cars are as comprehensively talented. However, those same owners that raved about these also reported a host of common issues and gremlins. Even the BMW techs that we consulted with, they have their concerns. So how about we get into this and kick off with the exterior? Okay, unless you're absolutely desperate for one, we'd be recommending you avoid any examples with a sunroof. Owners have reported everything from weird rattles and squeaks through to it not opening or not closing. Sometimes if the drainage channels get blocked up, the thing can overflow and water can get into the interior of the car. However, some owners have also claimed that even if the drainage channels are clear, excessive rain can cause leakage and water ingress issues as well. You think that BMW engineers would have accounted for heavy rain? However, that is far from the worst of the sunroof issues. Quite a few of these things have been involved in class action lawsuits because apparently even with just the natural flex of the body, the sunroof can flex to a point where it can crack, sometimes even explode. Obviously, this is not going to happen with every example of these, but it's just important to know that it could happen. Also on water leakage issues, the seal around the base of the fin antenna, it can wear prematurely in really hot climates like Australia, and this can let water into the car. And we'll elaborate more on this later in the video. And then we come to the reported issues with the powered tailgate. Apparently, according to the owners, sometimes it cannot open, sometimes it will open sort of halfway, then stop, or it can open all the way up and then kind of give up and just collapse. But we should state, this issue was far more prevalent on the earlier pre-update examples. Also, just on the whole earlier examples thing, it's important to know that this generation received a mid-life update, or an LCI update, as BMW call it, in 2021. And this brought with it refreshed styling, extra tech, and an expanded lineup, including a plug-in hybrid and an EV. But I know what you're thinking. What about the fire-breathing full-fat M models? Well, in our opinion, those things are so special, they deserve their very own video. We're not going to cover them in this one. Also, for simplicity's sake, we all know that the X3 and the X4 are pretty much the same vehicle, short of the rear-end styling here. So from now on in the video, I'm just going to say X4. Heaps easier. Also for simplicity, we're just going to be focusing on the combustion models. The EV and the plug-in hybrid, they're going to have to wait for another day as well. Now back to the whole LCI update thing here. The LED headlights were now fitted as standard, which is fantastic news, as long as you never have to replace them if the car's out of warranty. See, according to owners of pre-LCI update cars that have the LED headlights, these things can fill with condensation. Unfortunately, sometimes the only way to fix this is to replace the entire headlight housing. Guess how much BMW might charge you for that? In excess of $4,000. And that's before what they charge for actually fitting it and calibrating it. Also, it's important to know that if you need to replace that headlight, the entire front bar assembly has to come off the car. It's an incredibly labor-intensive job. And if you're getting your BMW dealership to do that, expect a huge bill at the other side. Actually, this is why plenty of owners recommended that you avoid the BMW dealerships for any out-of-warranty work. Apparently, according to them, an independent mechanic can quite often be much cheaper and can also offer a superior quality of work. Next up, some owners have reported issues with the central locking. Sometimes it locks, sometimes it doesn't unlock, even when you're using the key fob. Now, sometimes this might be an issue with the actuators, sometimes it might be a wiring problem, other times it might be an issue with the actual module that controls the central locking, which means sometimes it might be a really cheap and easy fix, and other times it can be the complete opposite. Again, the hot tip from the owners here is avoid your BMW dealership unless the car's under warranty, and make sure you check out the owners groups and forums, because there are plenty of great tutorials and advice to turn this sort of stuff into a fun little DIY project. Now, on models fitted with the very clever opening and shutting grills, sometimes they won't open and shut. Now, this can be a sensor issue, it can be a wiring corrosion issue, it might just be dirt and debris getting stuck in there and stopping the operation. Now look, we understand that these clever opening and closing grills are fantastic for aerodynamics and even engine efficiency, But putting fragile plastic parts and intricate electronics at the front of the car surely isn't a recipe for longevity. Now, this next one's super common on loads of European cars, but these are guilty for it. These brakes will cover your wheels in brake dust almost immediately. Now, a quality car care procedure will look after this, but plenty of owners are actually replacing the brakes with aftermarket items because not only will it stop the dust issue, they perform just as well as the OEM items and can often cost far less than what BMW are going to charge you. Actually, the hot tip here on aftermarket parts, no matter what car you drive, is to check out our mates at Automotive Superstore. Simply type in your rego and the site will filter down to the parts that are perfectly suited for your car. Plus, no matter if you're shopping for aftermarket brake parts or suspension or infotainment systems or speakers or dash cams, car care, full drive accessories, Automotive Superstore carry over 400,000 different parts and accessories. Plus, the best part is that you can shop entirely online and they'll deliver straight to your door. But what are these going to cost you to buy? Well, at the low end of the pricing spectrum, a high kilometre base model in interesting condition, going to be about 25,000 bucks. At the other end of the spectrum, a near new mint M40i, about 140 grand. However, one big complaint from the owners is just how intense some of the depreciation can be. Let's take this exact car, for example, 2018 M40i. Before options fitted and on-road costs, the new retail price was about $115,000. These days, more like $55,000. That's a $60,000 drop in 6 years, which could be fantastic news if you're buying one of these things on the used market, potentially heartbreaking if you bought one new. And to make matters worse, when you take comparable models from the X3 range and the Lexus NX range, on average, the BMW has lost 46% of its value, the Lexus 24%. And unfortunately, the bad news doesn't end there, or I should say, at least for me, it doesn't. See, I'm really torn here because Aaron that has lent this is a wonderful guy, top bloke, and he adores his pride and joy. And you know what? So would I, if it were the X3. Look, I don't want to offend Aaron here and potentially yuck his yum, but for me, the X3 is just the tougher looking vehicle. Look, this isn't anywhere near as dog ugly as say an X6, but it still just has this excessive bulk around the rear end, and for me it just visually throws the balance off. But then go and look at an X3, that thing just looks like a lean and more athletic version of an X5. And that's a really good thing. Actually, speaking of good things, let's talk about positives with the interior. And look, typical for BMW, the overall design, the look, the feel, even after this many years, even the smell, it all still gives you a sense of it being premium. In saying that, it maybe doesn't feel quite as high-end and as impressive as, say, a Genesis GV70, but this thing is still bloody, it's such a nice place to be. Now, the LCI update brought with it a larger screen and a fully digital instrument cluster, and for me, that is peak BMW interior design. The latest designs have this wraparound screen that just looks like it's stuck on there. It doesn't seem to be integrated into the overall design. LCI update of this, that's peak BMW. Even more so because the pre and post LCI actually have buttons for the climate control. With the brand new ones, you've got a bloody screen you've got to go through for menus and submenus. This, buttons for the win. Now, even in terms of fit, finish and build quality, really, really good in here. There's no movement to anything. There's no creaks or rattles. In fact, a lot of X3 and X4 owners mention that this generation feels noticeably better built than the previous generations. And the ergonomics, again, typical for BMW, absolutely spot on. These seats are perfectly comfortable and supportive. There's loads of adjustment in every possible way. It's just fantastic. Top points BMW, perfect ergonomics. Then in terms of actually using the interior as far as practicality goes, you've got this little trapdoor here, which I've noticed on this particular car is getting a bit stuck. Not ideal. Also, the wireless charging pad, there's issues with that. We'll get to that in a second. Cup holder's great. Flip-up armrest with a little removable tray and more storage underneath there. Huge door bins. Massive, massive door bins. Not so massive glove box. And I'm pretty sure this sunglasses holder is an aftermarket item. What does Aaron wear? He wears, what are these? Ah, schmancy, Aaron. Pradas. How's that? Yeah, it's pretty good for practicality. Oh, hang on, under the seats, nothing. And there's a little storage cubby hole down here as well, and that's felt lined, so anything you put in there is not going to go rattling around. Oh, also one more thing on the materials used in here. According to the plenty of owners, these interiors are really resilient. The leather wears really well. However, come across this all the time. Bloody gloss black plastic. This stuff scratches so easily. Why do manufacturers put it in high traffic areas like this? It can be sorted out and fixed, but just don't put it there in the first place. Now, as far as what features and equipment and safety tech you're going to get in here, look, honestly, so much. Way too much to talk about in this video. We'd be here for days. Instead, if you need all the specific information, go to ReDriven.com and check out the free X3 and X4 cheat sheets. It lists out everything you're ever going to need to know, including the common issues, so they're easy to refer to. Now, that said, even though even the base models of these come loaded with kit, you are probably going to get more stuff for your money in something like a Lexus NX, a Volvo XC60, an Alfa Romeo Stelvio, and a Genesis GV70. However, none of those cars, obviously, come with BMW's iDrive infotainment system. And I have to say, this for me is the best infotainment system in any car. Doesn't matter which generation you get in one of these X3, X4s, it just works beautifully. It's so intuitive to use. Unless you're looking at a pre-update car and you're an Android user, in that case, your phone's not going to talk to this system. In saying that though, there are aftermarket solutions for this. So just do your research. Owners groups, forums, it'll explain everything. But unfortunately, we now have to get into the bad news, what can go wrong with these interiors. Let's start with the not so serious, just more annoying stuff, like owners complaining that the bases of the seats can squeak and that the dashboard can be guilty of a few rattles. But apparently both of these are pretty easily fixed. Next up, as wonderful as iDrive is to use, some of the earlier systems can have some issues with Bluetooth and Apple CarPlay dropping out. Generally, a software update fixes this, although some owners have had issues where they've had to replace entire pieces of hardware to sort it out. That's incredibly rare, but remember how I mentioned issues with the charging pad? It's like most charging pads in cars. What it doesn't really charge your phone all that well, and it just heats the phone up so much that the phone turns itself off due to an overheating event. Then we have issues with the climate control. The blower motors with these can fail prematurely, but the good news here is it's really easy to access. Also, hot tip from the owners, maybe look at aftermarket parts instead of the BMW OEM stuff, because again, lasts longer and cheaper. Also on the whole climate control, make sure you check that this works at predetermined temperatures, like set it to 21. Does it stay at 21? If you can feel the air conditioning fluctuating from hot to cold, or if the top vents only blow cold air even when you select hot, that's not great. Now, sometimes this can just be a software issue and it fixes it up, but other owners have found that it's a far more insidious HVAC issue and the dashboard has to come out and all sorts of stuff has to be done to it. So it can cost next to nothing, or it can cost all of the thousands of dollars. But then we come to what I'm going to call just the stupid issues. The first one being problems with the TCB module. This is the bit of technology that looks after things like emergency calls if you have a crash, or SOS or GPS sort of things. Now, it has a battery, and like most batteries, it loses charge over time. So therefore, you would obviously expect that BMW would put it in a place that's really easy to replace. Yeah? No, of course not. Guess where it is? It's under the roof lining. Now, what's annoying about this is that the battery itself costs like $50, but to get to it, you have to remove all of the A-pillar trim and the roof lining. And according to owners that have had to go through this insane ordeal, sometimes it can cost in excess of $2,000. Some owners even claim that they've had to pay over $3,000 because something broke along the way. That is just stupid, BMW. But then, remember before how I mentioned the seal around the fin antenna can degrade and water can get in? Well, the problem with that is that can fry the actual TCB module. The problem with that is some owners have found that they've replaced the battery for $2,000, $3,000 and everything's working fine. But then over time, that seal perishes, the water leaks into the car, and then you have to change the module. The module is way more expensive than the battery, but then you've got to charge, or you've got to pay for all that labour all over again to get the whole bloody thing done twice, maybe 3 times. But that is not all with this module. Owners have reported that it can have its own set of issues. For example, some people have had problems where the module has called the emergency hotline and the call centre is God knows where, but then for that to end, even though you don't need it as an emergency, they have to hang up. But then when you hang up, it renders the entire infotainment system completely unusable for a bunch of minutes. But then when it restarts, for some reason the module then calls the emergency hotline again. It's just infuriating. And then we come to other stupid electrical faults regarding the gauge cluster in this whole area of the car. Sometimes the gauges work, sometimes they might not. Sometimes the entire thing lights up like a Christmas tree with warning lights, but there's actually nothing wrong with the car whatsoever. Also, apparently for some BMW owners and drivers, the indicator stalk never works. Now, these issues can be due to faulty sensors, maybe a wiring issue, maybe it is just a software issue and it just needs a software update to fix it. But other times, owners have had to replace entire instrument clusters and steering column arrangements to sort the issues out. But potentially the biggest issue with the instrument cluster is this stupid dimming lights issue. Now, there is so much written about this, there are so many YouTube videos about it, but basically what it is, some idiot engineer at BMW put a light sensor in the instrument cluster, so when the car goes through a dark situation, it dims the brightness of the instrument cluster and the screens. But the problem here is, it does that no matter what for some people. So if you're trying to reverse into a dark spot, sometimes you can't even see the rear view camera because it's that dark. Again, plenty of YouTube videos on this, check it out. It's insane. Okay, next up we have potential issues with the key, or I should say the key that you never use. What happens here is that the car can forget the lesser used key, so when you go to use it, it doesn't work. If you're buying one of these, make sure both keys actually operate the car. It can be recalibrated so the car recognizes the key again, but make sure the BMW dealership doesn't charge you too much for this, because again, we know of owners that have been ripped off. It should be, I think, nothing, because it's just recalibrating a key, it's easy. Now, another complaint from owners, not just of this particular car, but of loads of cars, are what some manufacturers try to charge you for simple consumables like wiper blades. But guess what? We have some amazing news for you. Wipertech can potentially stop this daylight robbery. Simply hit the link below to get 15% off and free express shipping on some of the easiest to order, easiest to fit, and best wiping wiper blades this side of South Carolina. Why South Carolina? It's because these were made in South Carolina, not Germany, not even in Europe. Also, as a thank you present to Aaron for lending us his car, he's going home with a set for free. And if you'd like a set for free, simply lend us your car, and if we feature it, you're going to get a set for free. Message us on the socials. And then in the back seat, I'm exactly 1 centimetre shorter than Demi Moore's X3 Ashton Kutcher. This is in my driving position, and you know what? It's better than I was expecting. I thought my head would be cramped because of the whole stupid coupe styling thing, but it's not. I've actually got headroom, good amount of foot room, good amount of knee room. Seats are on the bloody firm side and not very supportive, no lateral support whatsoever, and it does feel a little cramped and a little claustrophobic because it's so dark in here, but it's better than I was expecting. As far as practicality and features, obviously the features are going to vary depending on which model you're looking at. ReDriven cheat sheet has it all listed, but in this one you get air vents, you get your own climate control, power outlet there, 2 nets in case you go fishing and you need to put your barramundi somewhere, pull down armrest with, I love these cup holders, kind of Transformer style cup holders there. Door bins that you can actually get to if you have legs, which is fantastic. I think that's about it for practicality. Oh, no, the ISOFIX points. Plenty of owners complimented the back seats of these because the ISOFIX points, you don't have to go peeling off some bit of leather or fabric to get to them. They're right there. So with kids, great. Now in terms of boot space, if you're looking at an X3, really good news here. It has one of the largest boots in its class. And in terms of the X4, okay, technically it only loses 5% for overall cargo space back here, but that's only half the story. You lose a bunch of vertical space here, and this also has a load lip the X3 doesn't. So not only is it uglier, it's also less practical. Aaron, you're a legend, but you've bought the wrong car. Also, forgot to mention, not only do these seats fold flat, they can also recline back to make your rear seat comfort even comfier. But what about issues and concerns when it comes to the driving experience? Well, the first one we came across came from owners of M40i's. Some of them claim that the brakes can be really hard to modulate, not in terms of stopping power, but just in terms of coming to a smooth stop. Now, I don't want to judge anyone's driving abilities, but in this one, that's relatively smooth. For many owners, they're not real happy about the fuel consumption figures. Take the M40i, for example. Around town, they're reporting 14 to 15 litres per 100 kilometres. Even this actual car is getting about 14.4. Now, obviously, that will lower when you're out on the open road, unless your idea of the open road is some deserted, twisty mountain pass, then it's going to take a hell of a hit. Also, a few owners complained about the combination of the parking sensors and the AEB, or the autonomous emergency braking. Apparently, its calibration is too sensitive. Let's say you're going up or reversing into a ramp section, sometimes the car will just jump on the anchors. Now, this can be turned off, but it would just be nice if the calibration was sorted out properly from the beginning. But aside from those few complaints, most of the feedback we got in terms of the driving experience was overwhelmingly positive. Even that is a massive understatement. The owners love how these things drive. Now, BMW claims that the rear end suspension on the X4 is more performance calibrated than the X3, but I call bullshit on this. Honestly, you'd have to have some very serious driving talent and test the two cars back to back to ever tell the difference. No matter which model, these things are as sharp and as performance orientated as any driver's ever going to need. As we always say, a great performance car should be super enjoyable without having to push it to its limits, and this thing nails that. Even just pottering around town like this, the steering feel is so good, and the feeling through the seat of your pants is like communication. You can feel the car moving around, but not in like a harsh or unrefined way at all. Even some of the practical features, the parking assist that is fitted to some of these, is easily the best I've ever used in any car at any price. But the thing you really want to know about is, what is this engine like when you get a bit of a hustle on? So drop a couple of gears here. That is, one more time. An SUV shouldn't do that. It shouldn't do that at all. Even in terms of handling, shouldn't do that. It's very, very good. I hate admitting it, but yeah, it's great. But look, arguably, the very best thing about the X4 in terms of driving is that when you're driving it, you don't have to look at the exterior design. But look, seriously, if you only have room for one car and it has to do it all, these things are seriously hard to beat. That is, of course, unless these things can suffer from some catastrophic mechanical failures, but I can't elaborate on that because I'm not a qualified mechanic. You know who can, but it's Jim.
Now, to keep manufacturing costs down, a lot of manufacturers are now making these engines modular. Now, basically what that means is the 3, 4 and 6 cylinder engines all share a whole bunch of parts, things like pistons, rods, timing chain setups, valve train components. They share a lot of parts, which is good to keep costs down. But if there are issues with any of those parts, it means all of the engines have those issues too. I'll cover the petrols first. Now, one of the common problems we see on these is the PCV valve, or the positive crankcase ventilation valve. Now, that's a common problem to a lot of petrol engines these days, and in some cases you can just change the diaphragm or the valve, or even the housing that the diaphragm sits in. Usually pretty straightforward. No, on these it is moulded into the plastic valve cover. It's all one big modular piece, and you have to buy the whole valve cover to replace it. The problem also is, to get it off, you have to remove the high pressure fuel pump, you have to remove all the high pressure fuel lines, and you need to take the injectors physically out as well. Those injectors have got a Teflon seal on there, which you need a special tool to reshape. All of that just to get at the plastic valve cover and PCV assembly. It's kind of ridiculous, really. The oil filter housing on these petrol engines also is a very common failure point. Sometimes they can leak coolant, or they can leak oil, and they can leak that externally. That's not a huge deal, really, by comparison. Sometimes they can leak that internally, and they can get cross-contamination between the oil and the cooling system. If you get too much coolant in your oil, well, you can imagine what that can lead to. If it's gone undetected for long enough, often can lead to catastrophic engine failure. And we've seen those oil filter housings leak from about 80,000 Ks too, so you really have to keep a good eye on it. Like all modern BMWs, these cars have a very complicated cooling system. They have a part called the heat management module. Now, that's basically a unnecessarily complicated thermostat, and it controls the temperature for the engine and the heater system, does a lot of work. It's got a lot of valves in it, a lot of seals in it, a lot of moving parts. It's got a lot of external electric actuators. Very much unnecessarily complicated. They leak, the actuators fail, and typically, you know, we see these fail from 100,000 Ks, and they're a pain in the ass to get at, and they're expensive. And as you can imagine, the rest of the cooling system has a lot of plastic parts too, a lot of bypass hoses, tanks on the radiator, expansion tanks. They're all plastic, and they're great for the first few years, but after, you know, a few thousand heat cycles, they do start to deteriorate, and they do spontaneously just start leaking. And you can expect to replace any or all of the cooling system components on these from 100,000 Ks. The purge valve on these is another common problem. Comparatively easy and cheap to fix really. You'll know you've got an issue there. You'll just start logging some lean air-fuel ratio fault codes. Pretty easy on that one. Now, as far as the internal non-plastic engine parts go, these things aren't too bad, although they are known for having some Vanos complications. Sometimes that gear can break internally, and when it fails internally, you start getting some angular offset or basically valve train correlation fault codes. You'll get a warning light. Sometimes you get a warning light and then you'll hear the engine rattling. I have heard of cases where people have heard it rattling and rushed in and changed timing chains unnecessarily. If you do have this, you just make sure it's diagnosed properly, because the last thing you want to do is expensive timing chain job when it's just the sprocket. But those timing chains on these, actually so far, they're actually not too bad. They seem to be fairly reliable so far. Now, as I alluded to at the start, some of these engines are actually pretty good, and in these ones, it's the diesels. The single turbo configuration in these, I should just say, it might say on the engine twin power turbo. That actually means it's a twin scroll turbo. In this application, it is a single turbo. In this configuration, the single turbo setup, they are actually quite reliable. It's a fairly simple engine compared to the petrols. The valve train is fairly simple. They don't have a lot of the valvetronic complications. It's just pretty much old school camshafts and valves here. Now, one of the common problems we see on these engines is from part of the manifold. It has a whole swirl flap configuration. Now, they basically just soot up. And when they soot up, these little actuators, they stop working, and then the whole thing clogs up. And when they clog up, the little electric actuator on the side, that fails. It's all very expensive. Well, I should say it's expensive if you buy genuine ones. Non-genuine ones are significantly cheaper, and they are exactly the same. That's just an example of how they soot up inside as well. I've seen these soot up so badly, that hole is it's very tiny. You can't really clean these out. When they fail, you just got to throw the whole thing away and put a new one on. It's a relatively straightforward job, but it's also a very common job. Now, speaking of sooting up, in that manifold, that's where the map sensor is housed. We would recommend, if you have one of these, that map sensor should be taken out and cleaned every service. It is a cause of a lot of, poor engine performance on these. Another issue we see on these all the time is split boost hoses. They get oil in them and they get really soft, and then they just split. And when they split, or if the map sensor's clogged up, that can actually nearly always leads to DPF complications. Now, if those DPF complications aren't dealt with, you'll have to replace the DPF eventually. But if you're having DPF issues, it's really important you nail down any of those other issues, like manifold issues, map sensor issues, or boost leaks in general. And the same goes for the EGR system. They clog up too, and you'll know that because you'll just get fault codes. Not such a cheap job on these things. They are pretty expensive, and a common problem too, unfortunately. Another thing we see more so on the 6 cylinders, the B57, they have an issue occasionally with their harmonic balancer or the front crankshaft pulley. They can just start falling apart. They start rattling, and you'll hear that when it goes. Now, arguably, the most common problem we see with the petrols and diesels is complications from lack of servicing. Now, a lot of people think they're doing the right thing with the servicing on these, but the trouble is the BMW condition-based servicing, sometimes that leads to a service every 25,000 Ks, and that is just terrible for engines. Service intervals like that always lead to premature engine wear and sometimes premature failure as well. You have to service these things at least every 10,000 kilometres. The problem here is manufacturers push these condition-based services to keep the costs down. And what happens by the time the first owner of the car is done with it, they just roll into the next model, and that's fine. But when the people buy them second-hand, they've had this terrible servicing schedule and they have no idea just how bad it is for the engines. And the new owners pretty much get stuck with all the complications, and it can cost them a fortune. These condition-based servicing, pretty much in my opinion, is a bit of a scam and should be ignored at all costs. Service it every 10,000 Ks.
But we still need to answer the big question, should you buy one of these at all? Well, for the more consumer-focused models, no, you shouldn't. They're great to drive and they nail all the premium feels, but we think the long list of potential issues, high maintenance costs and steep depreciation just make them more trouble than they're worth. But what about when it comes to these performance M40Is? Well, these arguably offer 95% of M models performance for potentially $10,000 to even $20,000 less. They're arguably more comfortable to live with every day, and they look nearly identical, and overall we think they're just the more intelligent choice. Don't get us wrong, even a great M40i still struggles to make really a lot of logical sense. Plus, in this category, there are other vehicles that offer superior build quality, better reliability, and they make far more financial sense. However, none of those vehicles will probably put a smile on your face like an M40i. I mean the X3 version, obviously. Don't buy an X4 because people will judge you. However, if you were to play the sensible card, well, what should you buy instead? You should check out one of these. But if you weren't to be sensible with this or crazy with an M40i, what would you buy instead? We're really keen to know. Let us know in the comments. See you next time. Plenty of owners have recommended not going to your BMW. And you're probably going to get more bells and whistles in something like an